He shouldn't be able to do anything. It's getting worse and worse about him.
Just 60 seconds. That was all it took to create a seismic shock that shook Buckingham Palace and the entire world. The cameras were rolling. Millions watched with bated breath. And then, without warning, King Charles stepped forward and dropped a bombshell announcement no one saw coming. At the tender age of 12, Prince George was officially named the future Prince of Wales. But behind the halo of that historic event lay a brutal truth. The throne was trembling under a wave of outrage, and a 12-year-old's childhood was being stripped away to be used as a media shield. A red book containing a grueling schedule had silently locked down the boy's life. While the king used his supreme authority to manipulate his grandson, Prince William, and Princess Kate did not yield. Under the guise of obedience, they were quietly weaving a fierce counterattack right beneath the throne. Why the rush? Why force a child? What is the royal family truly hiding from us behind closed doors? Will Kate's maternal love be enough to bring down an entire system of power? And how steep will the price for this truth be? Silence can sometimes carry a more devastating impact than any explosion. The exact moment King Charles stepped up to the podium, the air inside Buckingham Palace seemed to be sucked dry. On the surface, it was a perfectly stereotyped scene. Solemn banners, royal guards standing as rigidly as statues carved from cold stone, and dozens of global camera lenses aimed at a single focal point. Every signal was flawlessly designed to broadcast a message of eternal stability. Yet hidden beneath that perfect veneer was a violent undercurrent of urgency. An irreversible rupture was waiting to detonate. There was no superfluous prelude. The announcement was delivered with a composure that sent shivers down the spine. At the age of 12, Prince George was officially named the future Prince of Wales. That title is not some glittering trinket to be pinned to a lapel during festive days. It is a massive boulder of history, chiseled from bloody conflicts, absolute loyalty, and the sheer weight of an empire. Placing that massive stone onto the fragile shoulders of a 12-year-old boy was not a symbol of pride. It was a red alert. It revealed a dynasty so desperate for survival that it lacked the patience to let time take its natural course. The camera lenses immediately zoomed in on King Charles's face. Within the warm, deep voice resonating through the speakers, one could still detect an incredibly subtle tremor. A breath held back half a second longer than usual. Was it the emotion of a grandfather watching his eldest grandson step into the river of legacy? Or was it the ruthless pressure of inevitability demanding he act instantly before the throne beneath his feet eroded away? Then the attention shifted to the figure standing beside the king. The 12-year-old boy. Prince George stood there with a meticulously choreographed posture that far exceeded the comprehension of his age. His back straight, his arms hanging down with strict control, his unblinking gaze fixed straight ahead. That composure did not carry the innocence of a child. Rather, it bore the resemblance of a machine, programmed never to show weakness. 12 years old. That should have been the age of noisy classrooms, ringing laughter on the football field, scraped knees from running wild, and secret dreams of a freely chosen future. But at this moment, the boy's future had been dictated by others, framed and sealed long before he had the awareness to comprehend the colossal size of the cage he had just walked into. Applause from beyond the palace's iron gates immediately echoed back. The grandstands roared, flags waved across the sky. Social media exploded in showers of praise for the great continuation. Defenders of tradition celebrated as if they had just won a historic victory. However, beneath that loud acclaim, razor-sharp questions began to sprout. Why now? Why the rush? Seasoned political observers instantly recognized an unwritten truth. British royal tradition never moves at this speed unless backed into a corner. Thrusting a child into the center of global attention was not merely a ceremonial honor. It was a militant manifesto. It was an act of seizing the stage to crush the voices of doubt. When institutions feel the pressure closing in, they do not retreat into defense. They attack. And today, the throne had attacked by using a child's life and freedom as a shield. The announcement lasted exactly 1 minute, but it had officially signed a death sentence for George's innocence. To understand why such a ruthless decision was unleashed, we must rewind to a few weeks before the title Future Prince of Wales sent shockwaves through the media. Behind the thick stone walls of Buckingham Palace, far away from camera flashes and the public's prying eyes, a secret meeting took place. The atmosphere in the room did not carry the air of a ceremony. It was as cold and sharp as an operating theater. All electronic devices were disabled. Service staff were ordered to withdraw. Only King Charles, his most seasoned advisors, and the Crown's chief strategists remained. What was debated across that oak table were profound fears the public was never allowed to witness. The men and women seated around that table had spent their lives protecting an institution older than modern democracy. But even they, the coldest of minds, had to acknowledge a grim truth: relying solely on the depth of history was no longer enough to guarantee survival. The focus of the meeting did not revolve around poetic rhetoric about legacy, but around brutal numbers. Public trust was wearing thin. Approval ratings among younger generations were in a free fall. Debates about the monarchy's obsolescence were no longer whispers in dark corners. They were growing louder in a world moving faster than the shadow of tradition. The throne, once deemed untouchable, was now placed under a giant microscope. Every move was scrutinized. Every silence was dissected. The advisors did not speak in panic, but with the urgency of men standing at the edge of a cliff. They warned the king that the future could not be managed passively. It had to be manipulated and shaped. A bold proposition was laid out. A generational signal must be launched. The world must be shown that the crown is not frozen in the past. Stop hiding the child behind safe walls. Bring Prince George into the light, not as a faint shadow waiting decades to touch power, but as a living symbol of continuation, right here, right now. Use the magnetism of youth to soothe the harsh skepticism of the era. The proposal hung in the stifling air, carrying the weight of a life or death gamble. King Charles did not nod immediately. To the strategists, it was just a move on the chessboard of power. But to him, it was his own flesh and blood. It was his biological grandson. Charles understood better than anyone the cruelty of royal calculations. He had spent his entire life buried under the shadow of waiting, enduring suffocating scrutiny. Forcing his grandson's destiny was akin to personally stripping away the final rare years of peace in a person's life. Half of him screamed with the instinct to protect the boy. The other half, colder and more ruthless, reminded him of his duty to the institution's survival. The tension in the room peaked. Could the royal family risk waiting for things to unfold naturally, or would that wait be judged by the public as weakness and hesitation? Outside the gates, the anti-monarchy movement was howling. Hesitation right now was not just a mistake, it was suicide. The advisors emphasized act now and write the narrative yourself, or stand still and let others dictate the fate of the throne. When the meeting concluded, no documents were signed, no press releases were issued, but an invisible boundary had been shattered. The concept of using a child as a shield had shifted from an idea to an action plan. And once the machinery of power had been set into motion, no single individual could stop it. King Charles had made his choice. To save the crown, he agreed to sacrifice his grandson's innocence. The death sentence for George's childhood was officially passed in the terrifying silence of that closed room. The public only saw the outcome through a fleeting 60-second announcement, totally blind to the brutal molding process that had taken place months prior. The stripping away of a childhood did not happen overnight by force. It was a subtle, gradual, and irreversible erosion. Imagine a 12-year-old waking up in the morning. He still goes to school, still runs on the grass, still jokes with his friends. But buried beneath that normal exterior, an extraordinary and heavy realization began to take root in George's mind. He was no longer a child waiting to grow up. He had been defined and fast-tracked in the shadowed corridors. George's schedule began to change. His free time was mercilessly slashed. In its place came the arrival of scholars, media strategy experts, and senior advisors. Lessons no longer stopped at textbooks, but shifted to the ironclad principles of sovereignty and duty. The 12-year-old boy was forced to sit still for hours, listening to cold analyses of how an ill-timed word could incite public outrage, or how a well-timed silence could consolidate power. Even more terrifying than the theoretical lessons was the psychological conditioning. George was put through simulated scenarios in front of cameras. He was taught to control his facial expressions to an absolute degree. He had to learn the art of maintaining a neutral smile, not too radiant to be deemed unserious, but not too cold to avoid being criticized as aloof. Every natural human reaction in fear, confusion, or spontaneous joy was crushed and replaced by an impeccably disciplined demeanor. This was not education for a boy entering puberty. This was the dismantling and rebuilding of a human being to serve the media machine. An invisible cage woven from protection and cruel expectations began to tighten around the boy. At 12, personal identity is still a free-flowing stream. Dreams are yet to take shape. But for George, every instinct now had to exist under the scrutiny of thousands of microscopes. Every wave of the hand, every step, every glance was analyzed and dissected in the press. Body language experts enthusiastically commented on his posture. Commentators incessantly praised his maturity beyond his years. But not a single one of them recognized the bloody price the child's soul had to pay to maintain that composure. The natural impulsiveness of youth was dead replaced by the presence of a calculated machine. Isolation began to close in on George from the smallest of things. He felt it through the sudden lowering of adults' voices when he entered a room. He noticed it through the ever-tightening security perimeter. Multiplied privileges meant his space for freedom was being choked. George had to start acting as the shadow of senior members at major events, learning to stay silent to project authority, learning to step back to yield the stage, and learning to stand as still as a statue to serve as the backdrop for the family's portrait. The royal family calls this process preparation, calls it tradition. Yes, it is preparation, but it is also the gradual narrowing of a sunlit path into a dark one-way alley with no turning back. History has left behind too many haunting scars. Heirs forced into the mold too early always carry invisible fractures within them. A massive weight of pressure disguised under a layer of privilege. The crown may be polished to a brilliant shine, but its weight is enough to crush anyone's mind. The cheers from the crowd outside the palace might echo like a triumphant epic, but inside the stone walls, the air grew increasingly stifling. Childhood does not disappear immediately. It fades away, replaced by duties peeled off layer by layer until nothing remains but an empty shell named duty. That is the most brutal tear at the heart of this event. A nation sees promise. A dynasty sees continuation. But trapped within that colossal structure is a young boy bitterly realizing that his future is not a choice. It is an inherited debt, and every step he takes forward is no longer guided by dreams, but dragged by the chains of history. If every lens during that historic announcement was aimed directly at the astonishment of the 12-year-old boy, the shrewdest eyes of royal observers were quietly focused on another target, Prince William. In royal politics, symbolism is everything. King Charles suddenly elevating his grandson to the pedestal of prestige was not just an act of personal honor. It was an earthquake that entirely upended the power structure within the Windsor family. For generations, the title of Prince of Wales has always carried a sacred and immortal rhythm. It follows a linear sequence, passed from one generation to the next through the cautious march of time. It is the sole bridge between the reigning monarch and the direct heir. Today, however, that rhythm had been broken. By placing an immense symbolic weight on George's shoulders prematurely, the royal family was not only signaling continuation, but also a compression of time. Time seemed to bend, and within that curvature, a barrage of sharp questions surfaced. William stood there bearing the identity of both a father and a future king, a man who had lived his entire life under the suffocating shadow of expectation. Better than anyone, he understood to his core the bloody cost of having one's destiny shaped from childhood. Outwardly, William's posture radiated absolute support, an unwavering demeanor, and unshakable dignity. He smiled a textbook smile that left no openings for the media to exploit. But to those who know how to read the complex layers of royal expressions, they recognized the fierce inner turmoil churning beneath that calm surface. There was certainly protection. There was certainly paternal love. But simultaneously, there was the bitterness of realizing the spotlight had been calculatedly shifted. History dictates that the direct heir shoulders the symbolic weight until the day they take the throne. But this event was like a beam of light sweeping straight forward, illuminating the third generation with unusually brutal intensity. Was this an affirmation of the Windsor family's solidarity or a calculated consolidation to serve the dynasty's narrative? Grandfather, father, son. 3 generations locked in an unbreakable arc. The image of 3 generations standing side by side is an absolutely lethal visual weapon. It personifies stability. It paints a picture of a dynasty that is not aging but constantly evolving. Yet evolution always comes with fractures. Elevating a grandson to the pedestal of prestige would inevitably distort the public's perception of the father. William was no longer simply a waiting heir. He was forced into the role of the chief architect for the next era. The public sees unity, but behind closed doors, there are massive layers of responsibility crushing down upon one another. From this second onward, William not only had to prepare for the crown inching closer to him year by year, but he also had to personally steer and guide a 12-year-old son who had just been thrown into the eye of the global media storm. William became the bridge and concurrently the sole shield trapped between a reigning king and a fragile symbol of the future. He had to appear strong, calm, and resolute. But even the sturdiest bridges develop invisible cracks when forced to bear weights that exceed their breaking point. As the echoes of the event continued to ripple outward, a cold truth became undeniably clear. This decision was never a sentimental gesture between grandfather and grandson. It carried sharp calculation. It carried a defensive vision. And above all, it carried the urgency of the survival instinct. The throne was facing unprecedented storms. Approval ratings were wobbling. Younger generations were openly questioning the legitimacy of tradition. Calls for reform were growing deafening. The British monarchy had survived countless upheavals, but this crisis took on an entirely different shape. Calling Prince George's name so early was not an honorary move. It was a preemptive strike, a shield of flesh erected to reinforce an institution riddled with invisible cracks. The crown had survived wars, scandals, and shifting ideologies. It knew how to adapt and survive. But surviving in the modern era requires more than endurance. It demands absolute control over the media narrative. Across the realms, anti-monarchy sentiment was no longer whispers in hidden corners, but was openly dissected in the broad daylight. The question was no longer taboo: should hereditary power continue to exist in a democratic world, demanding absolute transparency? In this suffocating atmosphere, timing became a strategic weapon. By publicly placing George on the pedestal, the dynasty unleashed a counter-message with the weight of 1,000 tons: the future is secured. A 12-year-old boy is not just an individual. He is an emotional magnet. The presence of youth softens the sharpest of skeptical glares. It invites empathy. It evokes rebirth. In an environment rife with criticism that the dynasty is a fading relic, using the innocent face of a 12-year-old completely manipulated the debate. King Charles had executed a masterful pivot. He forced people to stop asking, "Is this institution obsolete?" and made them ponder, "What future does this child represent?" That shift was not accidental. It was top-tier brand management. George was not just the heir. He became the living embodiment of a modern future, an approachable, relatable royal symbol, nurtured in the digital age, growing up under transparent global surveillance. The media's reaction instantly amplified that message. International front pages were flooded with the boy's image. Commentators enthusiastically dissected every angle. Debates that should have sunk into quiet skepticism suddenly erupted into a bizarre fascination. From a manipulative standpoint, the royal family had spectacularly succeeded in dragging the throne back to the center of every global conversation. Yet bold gambits never come with peace. This event fortified the foundations, but it also awakened unprecedented waves of outrage. Minutes after the announcement, social media splintered into factions. Hashtags climbed global trending charts. Behind the cheers of the royalists, a different narrative was taking shape: skepticism, anxiety, and profound indignation. A segment of the public hailed the decision as brilliant foresight, affirming that the crown's future had never been safer. However, that gloating was quickly extinguished by fierce waves of backlash. Child rights activists, psychological experts, and millions of social media users began posing thorny questions. Is 12 years old too early to shoulder the hopes of an entire nation? Was this truly a noble preparation or a cruel sacrifice masquerading under the guise of honor? The generational divide became starker than ever. Older generations clung to tradition and viewing succession as something sacred and inviolable. The younger generation fired back in anger, bluntly, questioning whether legacy has the right to crush personal freedom. The royal family no longer held a monopoly on the narrative. They were struggling in the eye of a storm made of millions of interpretations, facing the most profound cultural crisis in contemporary history. Amidst all the strategic calculations and media tug-of-war, one core question remained hauntingly unanswered. What did King Charles truly desire when making this brutal move? Every monarch longs to leave a mark, but rarely does anyone have the power and time to directly mold the future to such an extent. By determining the title of Prince of Wales for George at 12, King Charles exposed his ultimate ambition, a dynasty daring to leapfrog over generations to lock down tomorrow. But is this brilliant foresight or a life-or-death wager with history? To fully grasp the cruelty of this decision, one must look at the king himself. Charles did not ascend to the throne in a rush. He waited. 7 exhausting decades of preparation, of standing in the shadows, observing enduring ridicule, and forging patience. More than anyone alive, he has tasted the bitter flavor of existing beneath the shadow of destiny. That agonizingly long wait did not just prepare him for his role as king. It reshaped how he thought about time. To him, succession is not a concept on paper. It is flesh, it is blood, it is survival. And perhaps because of that obsession, urgency was now boiling over in his reign. The decision to push his grandson forward early carried deep personal significance. Charles wasn't just protecting a title. He was establishing a close proximity. He positioned himself not merely as a reigning monarch, but as a supreme guide, a fiercely powerful grandfather, a king with a cross-generational vision. In this way, Charles could personally mold and oversee the formation of the next legacy, while the crown still rested on his own head, rather than leaving it to the chance of the next generation. It was absolute control over historical continuity. Simultaneously to the outside world, to the nations and leaders of the Commonwealth, this move broadcast a resounding diplomatic message. This dynasty thinks in decades, not in short-term election cycles. Stability is not an empty promise. It is something put on public display. However, history always leaves behind bitter lessons. Grand visions rarely unfold according to the written script. Ruthless acceleration always carries the risk of snapping the very thing it aims to protect. Hastening the succession process can solidify trust, but it can also ignite resistance. When a leader acts too autocratically, they reshape public perception, but simultaneously place themselves within the most rigorous ring of scrutiny. The announcement event had concluded, the iron gates of the palace had shut tight, but a brutal truth remained. Everything had only just begun. Innocence and duty were now violently colliding within the soul of a 12-year-old boy. The free laughter of youth would soon be suffocated by the cold discipline of regal lessons. The boy would have to learn to shoulder both, but that balance is a bloody art. Prince George's life had been sharply bent toward eternity. Not tomorrow, not someday in the future, but right now. The transformation process had begun irreversibly. His name carried a new gravity. His presence bore a new meaning. Every word, every glance from now on would be weighed and measured against the colossal weight of the throne. The 12-year-old child had been shoved into the center of a centuries-old tradition, becoming the biggest victim in the Windsor family's power play. With just one sentence echoing across the globe, King Charles had permanently reshaped the fate of a human being and the future of an empire. But will this gamble fortify the foundations of Buckingham Palace? Or is it the first hammer blow to shatter the structure of a legacy? The answer remains hidden within the folds of time, awaiting the ruthless judgment of history. Closing the curtain of secrecy behind the cold iron gates of Buckingham Palace, this story undoubtedly leaves us with much obsession and inner conflict. When the stage lights fade, the crown may still shine, but the price paid in blood tears and childhood is indelible. As for you, the audience following this story, what emotions are you carrying right now? Do you believe King Charles's decision was a great and necessary sacrificial move to save the royal family, or the ultimate cruel selfishness of turning his 12-year-old grandson into a scapegoat for power? If you put yourself in William and Kate's shoes, would you obediently bow your head and endure for the greater good of the family? Or would you be ready to rebel, throwing away even the throne, to reclaim the right to a normal childhood for your son? And finally, under the suffocating weight of that invisible crown, do you predict Prince George will grow up to become a great king, or will he be the next victim to fall before the tragic curse of the Windsor family? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.